Good morning. Thank you everyone for attending this panel discussion. Large Pharma Biotech's leadership role supporting the commercial success of cell and gene therapies. My name is Keay Nakae. I'm a senior healthcare research analyst at Chardan Capital Markets, where our vision is to help identify companies with high potential for investment returns based on creating real value for society through disruptive innovation. Joining me on the panel this morning are Dr. Gabriele Proetzel, Director, Regenerative Medicine at Takeda, Mr. Bob Smith, Senior Vice President, Gene Therapy Business at Pfizer, Mr. Martin Golden, Senior Vice President, Head of Marketing Strategy at Astellas, and Dr. Brian Bronk, Head of External Innovation, Rare Diseases at Sanofi. So let's start by having each of our panelists briefly tell us about the key role they fulfill at their companies.
Okay, I'm Gabriele Proetzel from Takeda, and I actually switched a little bit role. I'm now responsible for the neuroscience, cell and gene therapy approaches. And at Takeda, we are, I think, fairly new in the cell and gene therapy and building out the strategy. So I'm really involved in the external collaborations.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Martin Golden. I work with Astellas as a Senior Vice President. We head up global market strategy. And in that role, from a commercial perspective, we work very closely with our development team and our drug discovery team, and work through a lot of the logistics, I think, that were articulated just a couple of minutes ago, whether it be the market access component and some of the supply chain logistics, and bringing that all together in a manner by which we can continue to return innovation really to patients.
Good morning, all. Brian Bronk with Sanofi. I'm a member of the business development organization at Sanofi, focusing on rare diseases. And in that role, I have a responsibility and an obligation to work with research development and commercial for bringing in novel therapies to our portfolio. And in rare diseases, that's frequently rare genetic diseases, and that fits very well with the gene therapy approaches that we'll be talking about through the course of the day. The model is mirrored in all of our other therapeutic areas, so we think about gene therapy and cell therapy across all of our TAs, with my focus being in the rare disease space.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Bob Smith, and at Pfizer, I'm responsible for our global gene therapy business. What we've strived to achieve over the last couple of years was to build an end-to-end capability within gene therapy. So from early discovery research through translational research, clinical development, manufacturing, regulatory, and hopefully sometime soon commercialization. We've been building this global capability through a strategy of internal capability building, selected acquisitions, and partnerships with leading companies in the space, as well as academic institutions.
Very good. So we have seen some pretty large acquisitions in this space over the last year. Kite, Geno, Avexis, in the range of 9 to 12 billion. What do these acquisitions say about big biopharma's interest in the cell and gene therapy space, if anything? Why don't you go ahead? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one thing it says is some people have larger checkbooks than others, and there's an appetite, right? So, all kidding aside, there's certainly an appetite. There's an interest. I think, as Bob was mentioning, there's an evolution going on. I will say that I don't think any one organization has all of the answers quite yet. So, depending on what an organization needs in terms of supplementing what they have internally or really just building from the ground up, these acquisitions can make a lot of sense for some. For others of us, where we have been working on this for a while, it may not be the right fit because we already have some of the pieces and don't need everything. But clearly for the two that were mentioned, there's an appetite, there's a desire to be here, and so for them it made sense at that time.
Yeah, I would probably add, I think the most significant factor is those programs that were part of those companies that triggered those acquisitions were incredibly transformational clinical benefit. And I think big pharma, big biotech interest in being able to take those programs from development stages or regulatory registration stages through commercialization is probably, as Janet mentioned in her opening remarks, is probably the biggest challenge. And probably big pharma, big biotech is likely best positioned to tackle that on a global scale. So I think that's been kind of a tipping point, at least in my personal view, on why companies like Pfizer, Sanofi, Astellas, Takeda are really interested in this space.
So let's expand on those two comments and step back to an earlier point of involvement. So what are some of the key factors that drive big biopharma decisions to build versus, or to buy versus build internally? Mar, do you want to answer that one?
I would just say a lot of it has to do with what you're looking to do. I mean, if you're looking to purchase a pipeline, a capability in something that's already mature and established versus something perhaps like gene therapy that continues to evolve and iterate very early, where you might be more interested in playing that forward and from a licensing or a royalty type of arrangement in that sense.
Gabriele?
I mean, like to continue on the comments before, it is a case by case. I mean, Takeda, we have bought Diagnostics. We have a relationship with Gamma Delta, which is built on a build-to-buy model, and it is a mixture of a pipeline fit where the assets are, and we believe in a lot of these external collaborations because we don't know what will win, and I think it's a very young field, so we need multiple partners to address the multiple questions.
Well, in terms of the collaborations we've seen to date, they run the range of passive equity stakes to options for co-development deals to maybe taking complete control of the asset through milestone and royalty models. So which of these models fit which situations best?
I'll go ahead and give a start to that, as it's one of my favorite questions, and the best way to not partner is to treat every partner the same, in my experience. So I don't feel that I have an answer for what the right model is across the board. It really is sitting down with thinking very hard and strategically what it is that we are seeking to gain access to, and then working with the partner, or potential partner, to make sure that those needs are met on both sides. So we will use all of those tools on a case-by-case basis, and it really is an attempt to try to match their needs, their sensitivities with our needs and sensitivities, and find out if there's a partnership that will make sense for both. So it's a long answer to say it really depends on how the fit is and what it is that we're trying to accomplish with them.
Yeah, I would just maybe echo a few of Brian's comments and just punctuate with a couple of examples from our own experience. So, we have a relationship with Spark Therapeutics on hemophilia B gene therapy, and the way that started was, a program that at the time that we originally did the deal in late 2014 was pre-IND. We structured that deal so that through the transition of activities that, Spark was already, putting that IND package together. They were planning to do a phase 1 study at centers that we were comfortable with. They took responsibility for manufacturing material for that study. They ran the study. We just recently transitioned it to us a few months ago for us to take over the pivotal study work and all of the future manufacturing activity. So, when we put that deal together, we were looking at, we didn't want to drop the ball anywhere along the line, but we also wanted to use all of their capabilities that they had already established that we hadn't yet, and do it in a way that we wouldn't put the program at any risk for delays in a transition or integration type process. We kind of replicated that with the second deal that we did with Sangamo on hemophilia A. It's generally structured the same way. And we've also done transactions, for example, with 4D Molecular Therapeutics. We made an initial equity investment. We then did a research collaboration. Just a month and a half or so ago, we participated in another round of financing that they did. So, to just, put a little life into Brian's comments, I think we all use multiple tools to best structure and a transaction, not just for like our own needs, but also what makes most sense for the project, what makes most sense for our partner. And, I think that's just an example where you need to be flexible and adaptable and do the right thing for the asset first, and then think about what's best in terms of all the transactional aspects.
Actually, I want to reinforce that. putting the project first because the patients are waiting, right? It's such a cliche thing to say, but if you go into the discussions, both parties are going to agree to that from the outset. Let's make sure the project moves forward as quickly as possible. There are a group of patients that are really hoping this is going to work. And if you think that way, you can usually find common ground.
And to what extent does your corporate culture play into which model you use? I know a number of you have worked at different companies, so you've been exposed to different cultures. So how often is that maybe the final consideration of which path you're going down?
Well, at least, from our vantage point, gene therapy is housed within our rare disease research unit and a rare disease business unit. So even though Pfizer is a quite large global company, the way that we manage the gene therapy business within a very small business unit within Pfizer makes it very intimate. So, from an end-to-end perspective, we're pretty much in touch with every aspect of the development programs, our manufacturing facilities, regulatory. We're doing a lot of work now trying to think through some of the commercial aspects and particularly challenges with market access. So I would say, our corporate culture, if you look at it at macro level, is large, potentially bureaucratic, cumbersome, things like that. But when you get to the operational aspects of who's really doing the work in gene therapy, it's a very small, dedicated, focused, passionate team of people.
How about at Takeda?
I think at Takeda, actually when Andy Blum joined the company, he did a real big transformation. He had sort of two, I think, sort of take-home points. Is one, externalization, really work with external groups and good partners, and also expand modalities. Takeda was known being a small molecule company, and it really put down on basically on the KPIs for all therapeutic areas, including neuroscience, which has a much harder time to use antibodies and other modalities. To look is like what is out there, but also with a focus what makes sense for the patient. It's definitely always patient first, and I think it made a big change to motivate everybody to look who is the best to work with, and to go to expand from what we know to do, go into new uncharted areas.
Yeah, I would add to that too. At Astellas, we focus on the science first, wherever that science is, and oftentimes we keep the science with some of those smaller, agile partners that we work with in many different arrangements. And for anybody that's ever negotiated with a smaller entity in one of the business development deals, oftentimes that can be a very, very important point in who their choice of a partner is. So we focus on where it is, and the best science, the best people, we keep that in those locations, regardless of if we absorb them as an entity.
So the next couple questions really have to do with what does big bio, big pharma really bring to the table. And let's start with R&D. And what is their role and edge? Can they advance programs faster than the small company? Up to what point? And again, given perhaps their own internal risk hurdles that have to first be overcome, how would you guys answer that question?
No. I guess I'll start. I would say one of the big advantages that we have is scale in terms of the number of resources we could apply to a particular project. We have global reach. So when we run a pivotal study, we run it in a global way. Multiple countries, multiple sites within countries. We obviously go through a prioritization process when we think about how to optimize the subsequent commercial value of that. And I think where we also have a potentially competitive advantage is our ability with financial wherewithal to make capital investments at risk. So I know that there's been a lot discussed over this course of this conference and in prior years about constraints in manufacturing, particularly in viral vector production. That's a problem that we recognized early on, and from our prior experience with biologic manufacturing, vaccine manufacturing, we knew that you need to make those types of capital investments at risk before you have a line of sight into a potentially viable commercial product. And that's a financial risk that companies of our financial wherewithal are willing to take and are able to take. And that's something that maybe with smaller companies, it's more of a stage-gated type of approach. We obviously apply a lot of financial discipline in our thinking about when the actual timing of capital investments are made. But we've embarked on production or construction of facilities when we had programs that were in preclinical stage. They're now in clinical stage, but what we thought was the most prudent way to attack these types of problems is if you don't have the manufacturing capacity to support pivotal studies and ultimate manufacturing, you just introduce delays later on. And if you have to do multiple transitions from a small-scale facility to a potential CMO back into an in-house facility, that also adds a lot of complexity, regulatory risk, and it could potentially jeopardize the viability of a program. So, we attacked it with the view that we'd be taking significant risks, but they were prudent risks that we thought would pay off, and we're now in the process of executing on that plan, and hopefully we'll be successful, and patients will be rewarded, our shareholders will be rewarded. So I think it's just a nature where scale is a potential advantage.
How about advancing through the preclinical phase 1, phase 2? Can you do that faster, quicker, with more agility in the small company?
So I'll go ahead and give that a start. I think that's where that's where these transition points start to come in, and even getting back into the preclinical research stage, there are some areas where at Sanofi, based on the legacy of Genzyme, we have a disease expertise that we still think is unmatched in the industry. If we can bring that to a project, to a partnership, we will offer that. It doesn't mean that it moves exclusively to the Sanofi hallways, but there's ways that we can work together on that. The more we go through it and we get into where the scale really does help, preclinical toxicology, I think those can be, it really is going to depend on who has what expertise. But as Bob said, we are always thinking about what is the global plan for development and commercialization, whether it's a clinical plan or CMC, industrial affairs type of considerations. We start that thinking very, very early in the life of a program, and we look at it within, let's say, within gene therapy at a portfolio of programs as opposed to a program. So that thought process, I think we can bring value early on. In terms of execution, there are definitely times where the right thing to do is to leave it with a smaller, more nimble partner, and we just work together to make sure that the decisions that are being made are sensible decisions.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. We've actually kept a bit of a hybrid approach in that we have somewhat of a separate entity that's doing some of the early phase 1 work, and yet we leverage a lot of the shared services that exist in any development organization. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, where you don't slow down an otherwise agile team, but you take advantage of the resources that you have internally in other internal development functions. And it's already been stated, and I think the biggest take-home message for us in this whole process is you cannot get involved commercial early enough in this process, because the difference between being able to recapture your investment and not needs to be planned out exceptionally early in the process.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all what has been said before, and we see the same thing. It's important to think early on commercial clinical trial design, and I think the network a large pharma can bring, and the expertise that really makes the program successful. I think it's also not all about speed, because you can be very quickly in clinical trials, especially from the academia. But that does not mean it guarantees success. It doesn't mean necessarily first to market.
So then let's move on to manufacturing. Obviously, lots of discussion about the cost and the scalability of some of these personalized therapies. We have the issues of compatibility and purity of the payload. So beyond the capital and the expertise, which should be your edge and advantage that you're bringing to the table, does the industry need the involvement of large biotech, large pharma to solve these manufacturing issues?
Yep,
One of us has to go first.
I would say definitely yes. I mean, I feel like we're in the trenches on this particular issue. Certainly capital is important. Expertise is important. The human knowledge and expertise is critical. We've been leveraging an 800-person team within our Biologics Pharm Sci organization that supports vaccines, biologics, and now gene therapy. There's a lot of transitional learning from these other platforms that you can apply to the particular gene therapy approach that we're using. We have a lot of expertise with transitioning programs from academic standard types of analytical methods into a more commercial, higher quality, more rigorous validation type environment that is important when you look at rolling out a program through a global regulatory infrastructure. What we've been trying to do too is be flexible in assessing different manufacturing platforms. So we're using in some products adherent cell culture approaches, cell suspension approaches. We're using mammalian cells. We're using baculovirus-based approaches. Now, part of this is just given the nature of how we have put our portfolio of programs together, but there is a lot of kind of experience that you can gain when you're working in different platforms to ultimately down the road project 3, 5, 10 years what is going to be the optimal platform for the portfolio of products that we hope that we'll be building. And so, early on we're taking on a lot of complexity and maybe some added cost, but hopefully the benefit will be is we'll have a much greater knowledge base. And it's particularly as each program progresses through regulatory interactions, you learn a lot about, what the environment looks like and where the standards will be set. And our aspiration is that we will be a standard setter in terms of, the quality and analytical attributes of these types of complicated products.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of learning that is going on, especially with the regulatory interactions and the feedback there. I think a large company, because of the experience in other sectors of manufacturing and CMC, Pharm Sci, we bring a thought process on quality control, on analytics, on just what is going to be needed from a regulatory perspective, and that can be applicable to novel modalities. And so that's something that very similarly we see and we think we can really help with. And we're learning together on what the right way of approaching it is. There is a quantity, just sort of a capacity challenge right now in the industry. The capital investments are going on. I don't think any of us would deny that we're pushing up against what we currently have. These normally are supply and demand issues, and they will equilibrate at some point. But for right now, it's even with the highest quality standards that any organization can bring, depending on the system that one wants to use, there are definitely bottlenecks for how much the overall industry can make on any given per annum basis right now.
So when we think about the comparability requirements and the eventual need to scale up or scale out, as the case may be, does that mean that large biotech, large pharma needs to get involved in these manufacturing decisions earlier on?
Yes. I mean, for a lot of the reasons already stated, from a resource standpoint and the learnings and the interaction, it's as I often say, it's a little bit like changing the tire on your car while you're driving it. And you need to be able to continue to iterate there and take the learnings, and having the resources to do that is very helpful. And depending upon whether you're planning in an ultra-orphan audience or even in a bigger one, the bigger the audience, the more that needs to get involved early to understand what your scalability and what your investment is going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all said, and I mean, it's still early times. And when we think back about the antibodies and also the issues to get higher yields, so I'm sure we also can, in terms of the vector production, we'll get more efficient and higher yield productions. I also think academia is important, not just large biotech, to really think about novel approaches and novel analytics. So I think the whole community is really important to move this field forward and make it more efficient and better.
Okay, so maybe advancing the product to the point of commercialization. Certainly, big pharma has the existing global infrastructure to do so. But many of the therapeutic targets that these companies are focused on are rare or ultra-rare diseases. So in these cases, what value add does big pharma still bring to the table?
Sorry, you want to go first?
Well, yes, yeah, I do. I mean, because I think this is what Genzyme originated from. It's yes, the patient numbers are smaller, and as we get into some of these, as we think about cell therapy as it exists today, you're even talking about very specialized centers. How do you find the patients that will benefit across the globe, and how do you get those therapies to them? And I think that's something that we continue to try to do. Certainly at Sanofi, and I'm sure every other large company is really thinking of it that way. So it may not be about, well, how do you get to the key places in the United States or in Europe, but there is a lot of the rest of the world, and how can we develop and commercialize and provide medicines across the globe in an economically meaningful manner? And there's two sides to that part of the equation. So I will absolutely acknowledge that where one needs to get to, it's a smaller number of places, but at the same time, thinking about it from that global perspective is, I think, very important for everyone.
Similar to the Genzyme Sanofi situation, we have, for 20 years, have had a rare disease business with well-established franchises in a number of disease areas. And so for us, it's not so much ultra rare or rare. It's more a question of where do these potential new modalities fit into a franchise building approach. And for us, particularly in hemophilia, we have been in that space for 20 plus years. I think there was a nice panel discussion about this as a therapeutic area yesterday, and the role of gene therapy. So the existing therapeutic options for patients are satisfactory in some ways, but suboptimal in other respects. So I think gene therapy approaches can definitely bring value to patients beyond the current therapeutic options that they have. And to build on Brian's point, there's 400,000 hemophilia patients in the world, and the vast majority, I think the World Hemophilia Foundation estimates that roughly 70 to 75% of them are either not treated or undertreated. And so if you think about in parts of the world where these patients with a very severe disease don't have any treatment options at all, and you look at a one-time administration therapeutic option for them, it's quite appealing that you're just going to leapfrog the existing therapeutic options. And I think that is something that industry, regulatory bodies really need to, and I think through organizations like ARM, this is the kind of conversation that needs to happen to be able to bring value to these patients, because it is a solvable problem. We just have to find a solution.
In terms of the marketing effort to have a successful launch of a cell or gene therapy, how do you view the differences in what's required for one of these types of products versus what you currently are marketing and selling?
Well, obviously the audience is less, so smaller, more finite usually if they're ultra orphan. So you don't need the massive sales forces and the infrastructure there, but you do need oftentimes the data piece, the real world evidence, the continuing building of the evidence over time. And most of the time we're seeing these phase 2 trials being regulatory approval trials essentially. And right, wrong, or otherwise, what's been approved thus far, whether it even be the CAR-Ts or some of the other gene therapies, the uptake of these products has been rather light. And initially, they show that they're being covered, but when it comes down to it, the patients aren't able to get many of these because there's very stringent criteria that are built into the prior authorization process. So very few of the patients, notwithstanding the sensationality of it, are actually getting these. And how you take that from what looks to be a restrictive phase 2 trial with exclusionary criteria that's being applied even sometimes more stringently externally, and building that data package after that and making sure that you're continuing to develop the product is going to be more important than a sales and marketing type of approach that's historically been done.
Well, let's shift the discussion to pricing. Obviously, for some of these therapies, we've talked about the issue of pay for performance, these value-based pricing models. Give us your general thoughts on big bio, big pharma's view of these types of creative, novel pricing mechanisms.
Well, I guess my view is we need to be as innovative on market access and value aspects of these advanced therapeutics as we do on the science. And to just echo some of Janet's opening comments, I think there are pretty well thought out options that could work for the vast majority of stakeholders in the system, but there are constraints that need to be, I think you used the word underbrush. I might use a different word, but I think they're all solvable problems, and I think there needs to be a concerted effort by industry players, by patient advocacy groups, by the payer system collectively, both public and private, and through interactions with policymakers to make these types of advanced therapeutics available to patients. I think that's the ultimate goal. And the complexity of any single country's healthcare system is going to dictate the magnitude of difficulty in making that a reality. We here in the United States, which is probably one of the more complicated systems, I think it's going to take a lot of work to get there. It'll probably take longer than any of us would hope, but I think it is a solvable problem, and I think it's not going to be the situation where any one segment of the system will be able to drive it to a solution. I think it's going to take a concerted effort, and that's the approach that we're taking, and which is why we've become such a prominent, I think, participant in organizations like ARM and in discussions in venues like this, that we hope that we could use our emerging portfolio of gene therapy products as a catalyst for some of these discussions, from our particular vantage point, but also within the collective community, and particularly with the patient community. I mean, patients are desperate for these types of innovative therapies, and I think it'd be a collective shame on all of us if they're not able to get access to them.
Yeah, it's for me the pricing discussion in these cutting-edge innovative therapies and the one and done and the potential impact that will have medically and economically. It's not a pharma question. It is it's across all aspects of the payer system. And so we do really need to be working together on how to solve it. And it is complicated. The concept of the value-based pricing or the pay for performance, it's a great concept. The devil is in the details. And those details differ by geography, by country, and so there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do together. But conceptually, it's a sensible proposal. There are ways of solving for it. It's just a matter of everyone coming together and saying, yeah, we need to sit down and figure this one out.
Yeah, just to add to that, there's a lot of talk about value-based contracting, outcomes-based contracting, but when you really look at the landscape, whether it be here, Europe, or any other country for that matter, there are very few agreements that are actually founded that way. I mean, this has already been pointed out. The foundation of our healthcare system is not conducive to curative therapy. We're dealing with one-year budget horizons and Medicaid best price and a lot of things that prevent logistically from doing it. In the old paradigm, when you thought about blockbuster, small molecule, the Lipitor's of the world, it was a bit of a splattershot approach. But as we've moved ahead, and the science and the regulatory landscape has now actually moved ahead of the reimbursement landscape to some extent, and we have to get a multi-stakeholder really fix in place here, because if you're the patient, I don't know how many people read the Wall Street Journal this morning, but they said the annual insurance for an employer-sponsored insurance for a family is now over $20,000, and the out-of-pockets to patients have tripled since 2006. If you're a payer, you're looking at some of these curative therapies with skepticism, and how long they're going to last, and am I going to be able to afford it, and what does that payment scheme look like to me? And if you're a manufacturer, we're really interested in doing value-based contracting, but you have to be able to do it in a sensible way which you don't get punished by, and even just something as simple as Medicaid best price is a pretty big hurdle. And collectively, through advocacy, policy discussions, those things need to be solved in order for this to really take up.
Gabriele?
Yeah, when I agree to everything was that it's very obvious that these therapies are so new, and I think there is just not sufficient data out to make people comfortable, and nobody knows, is this curative, is it 10 years good, and like how do you deal with it? I think it's also on the commercial side. In the old models you get, your patient comes back, so you have your annual income, now you have a one-time income. And if it's a one-time payment, so it's I think it's complex, but it should be solvable. But we need to think very different compared to the the drugs we are used to up to now.
So given that a lot of these details have yet to be worked out, if you're looking at a potential acquisition and their primary assets are ones that are going to have to be sold under this type of model, is that a red flag that prevents that acquisition from going forward? I know as an analyst, the first question I know we're going to ask management is, how long is it going to take for this to be accretive? So what's your answer to that?
Well, I mean, when we look at potential business development opportunities, regardless of what the transaction structure is, obviously what the product profile, the value generation opportunity is certainly like a fundamental aspect of why we're looking at it. So we factor in various scenarios that may come into play, and we also look at what the potential risk issues are for any particular opportunity, and come up with a risk mitigation plan that we would execute against those particular risks. And some of them are going to be more tractable to solutions and others aren't. And so we just, we look at that in balance, and we apply appropriate risk adjustment factors and time value of money calculations, and kind of the standard 1, 2, 3s of how do you do M&A, and we factor all of that in. I think in this particular area where it becomes more challenging is there's a lot of fluidity in the overall system. So I look at some of the very constructive potential changes in the regulatory environment, which I think are favorable. So it kind of puts things into a more positive light when you think about the probability of regulatory risk, the timing of regulatory approval, the complexity of and size of a clinical development program. So those things all kind of go on the favorable side of the ledger. And then on the other side of it is the more uncertainty with some of these market access challenges that we have, and how that may evolve with the now commercialized products, all of which have been approved in roughly less than a year or so. I think those will help inform market participants' view on the timing of that. Some of these challenges will get resolved, and I think maybe to your earlier, I think your opening question, why were companies willing to pay $9 to $12 billion to acquire companies with these types of transformational advanced therapeutics? I think it is, the general view is, these problems will get solved, and these early approvals are really going to be a bellwether for how successful and they'll be, and I think they'll help inform others' view on the risk that some of these challenges get resolved. I mean, I look at it in a very optimistic light, which is the challenges is known, the solutions are available. It's just how do you get there? And I'm not a government policy lobbyist expert, but from a very pragmatic kind of scientific finance business type of view, I think we should be able to solve these problems. It's going to take a catalyst of multiple stakeholders to push it over the line.
I would just add to that. I think it traditionally had a very standardized model of looking at BD type of acquisitions with uptake of products, and there is a little bit of tempering of that, knowing where we are today. But similar to the comments, we're actually playing for where we're going to be, not necessarily where we are, unless you're looking at something that you need to be accretive to the top and bottom line right away, and you have to temper your expectations with the current environment.
You know, with the recent commercial launch of some of these innovative but high-priced therapies, you know, a key stakeholder is the PBM. So in the case of an Express Scripts, for instance, their involvement in the actual distribution of the product. What's your view of that? Is that a good thing, or you know, what are the risks, certainly to you guys, of their deeper involvement in that part of the distribution?
I mean, it's a pilot, right? And I, you know, is how I would define it. Does that mean, is this the right answer? I think it's too early to say. It certainly carries some you know, potential risks, but yeah, we have to start to move on these challenges. And you know, as you know, despite the concerns that or that could come forward with it, there's also, that's a pretty big step forward to say, let's try it this way. And so, you know, in some ways, it's great to see that there is a partnership there on let's try it under these circumstances. Let's find out how well it works. What I would hate to see happen is, therefore, that's how everyone is going to do it in the future moving forward. We just have to. It's one way of trying to move here. You know, one of the things that sort of came up at the beginning was have these therapies arrived, and it's a really interesting question. Research, development, commercial, regulatory, yes. Or sorry, research, development, regulatory, yes. We're there. The commercial model, there are products out there, and the uptake has been very, very slow, and patients are being restricted from it right now. And that's, I think the answers are there, and you know, the example that you just gave is one attempt to try to find a solution that works for some, and then we'll have to find solutions for others as well.
Yeah, I'd add to that too, that I think with specialty distribution on a lot of these models, particularly the small ultra orphans, and depending upon the patient population that you're looking at, they may or may not be a player in that. And from my perspective, it almost speaks more to them recognizing where science and then the patients are going to be eventually, and given the current business model, how they're looking to evolve to stay relevant.
Okay. Let's talk about the ability to penetrate markets outside the U.S., China, Japan. Obviously, one of the advantages of partnering is the ability to have a quicker, more efficient, more successful commercialization of the product in those geographies. So can you comment on that, and what do you feel like, especially maybe in Japan, let's start there, what the advantages of partnering with large pharma, large bio to get into those markets?
Yeah, well, Japan, Astellas is a Japanese company, and we have a lot of experience in the Japanese market, and there are some unique nuances to developing products in Japan. In the cell and gene therapy space, back in 2014, they passed some regulations which would allow very early conditional approval of cell and gene therapies with as little, and there's a couple products that have been approved with as little as 6 or 7 patients in a single-arm phase 1 trial. So you have ability to get the product on the market either through that or through the accelerated approval process in Japan. It's called Sakigake, which is a nuanced, slightly different but accelerated path in Japan. We currently have a product right now that was just approved within the last couple of weeks for AML under the Sakigake designation. So having all that infrastructure and knowledge of the Japanese market can really be clearly an opportunity for that going forward. I'll just make one more point, and then we'll get the Takeda perspective on this. From a regulatory standpoint, as I said, things have moved much faster than the commercial standpoint. You still have to negotiate your price in Japan like you do in many governments. And some of the nuances to that that need to be played forward are, when you do negotiate a price in Japan, your price is visible in Japan. So if you normally, most multinational companies would launch a product in Japan after Europe and Japan because of the pricing implications in Japan. And if you don't get the price that you need to get because you have very early data in a very cost-effective way, that can actually penalize you. It can also impact your European business. So you need to be very nuanced and aware of not only the regulatory aspect of it, but the commercial impact not only within Japan, but outside of Japan.
Yeah, thank you for explaining the Japanese system. And I think it's very important to have this really close connections in Japan with the regulatory and also with the pricing agencies. Also what I learned is like also the price is reviewed every 2 years, so it's not given for the whole product life. So they have a quite stringent review process, and usually they try to push the price down every 2 years. And that means you really need expertise like in Japan on site who understands how all these activities are managed.
And I'm going to guess that Pfizer is going to have a very similar model to what I'm going to offer here. This is back to one of the earlier questions on what is it that a large biopharma company brings to a partnership. It is this global regulatory and market view and the understanding of how each of the regions, each of the countries, what their expectations are and how that can influence and impact across other regions and industries. It's there's also the possibility that some of the agencies and the countries that we're talking about, or maybe even not talking about, they may be able to come up with more creative solutions to this approval and pricing question than some of the more established places, because they don't have something as locked and loaded as what we would say we have in the US, where the model doesn't work for what we're talking about today. So yeah, there may actually be some creative opportunities out there if you think about, is there a way to solve somewhere else, and then can that solution come back and reverse engineer into the more established markets? To be determined, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, I would again echo Brian's comments as well as Martin and Gabriele's, but there's also kind of perspective that I have. When I started in the industry, it was very common that you would launch a product in the United States in, say, year 1, Europe in year 3, Japan in year 7 to 10, and then the rest of the world 10 plus years later. I don't think that model is going to work anymore. And I think for these types of products, especially when you're looking at potential rare diseases, the ability to contract that progression of global rollouts is really important. And I think from a patient perspective, from a return on investment perspective, and so for companies of our collective scale, that's a significant advantage versus a smaller company that's going to do multiple deals on a geographic basis or with selected partners for regional or country-specific commercial opportunities. And having the connectedness of a global infrastructure really adds a lot of efficiency to that process. And as Brian described, from development, regulatory, that's well worked out now. And I think the commercial piece of it is where you have an existing infrastructure. The degree of operating leverage that you can get with rolling out a global launch is pretty significant. So I think that's a big advantage that all of us have.
So final question for the panel. A lot of very enthusiastic discussion at this meeting about the tremendous amount of progress we've seen just in the last few years in the development of cell and gene therapy. If you just look at the attendance at this meeting compared to over the prior years, that would tell you, or at least prompt the question that has cell and gene therapy arrived? We do have some tangible evidence from the acquisitions that we talked about earlier. So in the opinion of big bio, big pharma, has cell and gene therapy arrived?
Well, in my view, absolutely yes. But it's early. And I think, the evolution and the advancement of the number of programs that are in development across multiple diseases, multiple modalities is pretty impressive. I sat through some of the company presentations and yesterday afternoon, and I think almost every one of them had a program in the clinic. And a year ago, maybe half of them. 2 years ago, maybe a third of them. 3 years ago, maybe 20% of them. So, you know, from a relatively short, you know, time period, there's been a significant improvement in terms of the scope. I would also probably describe the quality, the level of sophistication of the number of participants in the space. I view it all as being, you know, really exciting. I couldn't think of a better place to be working at the moment. So.
I mean, I think I sort of answered it before. The train is definitely pulling into the station. I mean, it is here, and the research, the development, the number of programs in the clinic, the understanding that we're gaining on, you know, the process is the product, and what does that mean exactly? And we have to figure out this market access piece, because, you know, for it to really arrive for patients and for the overall pharmaceutical system, there has to be sales that generate revenues that help patients. I mean, that piece isn't there yet. So there's work to be done, but in terms of, you know, bringing it to that point, the momentum is so strong that, you know, it's on everybody's shoulders to make sure that we figure out how to solve that.
Agreed. I would almost say that the science and the regulatory piece are driving the train, and commercial is the caboose. and they will take it there eventually, but it's going to take a while for a lot of that policy to get sorted out.
Yeah, I also agree. It's definitely here, and it's going to stay. I think there's also still a lot of new science going to come. I feel it's like early antibody days, so it's like there are a lot of things to be worked out. But I mean, also you see this big pharma being so engaged, and it's not going to go away.
Well, great. I think we'll end there. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to ARM for scheduling this presentation.
Thanks.